The assault on Snodgrass, the defining moment of the Battle of Chickamauga. Snodgrass House, a small building on top of a hill surrounded by forests and farmland in northwest Georgia, became the center of conflict on the fateful afternoon of September 20th, 1863, at the height of the Battle of Chickamauga. This once beautiful land was now filled with the dead and dying of both Union and Confederate armies. Countless Confederate assaults up the slopes through fertile fields and dense forests would be repulsed with heavy casualties and lack of effective coordination. It was only the fading light in the fact that most of the Union Army was in a chaotic retreat towards Chattanooga that forced the Federals to withdraw. This elevated space cemented the legacy of Union General George H. Thomas as the Rock of Chickamauga and granted the Confederates their last major decisive victory of the Civil War. This peaceful area along the Chickamauga Creek was brought into the war between the states over the nearby city of Chattanooga, Tennessee. This city, the gateway to the Deep South, due to its status as a hub for railway lines, was considered of vital importance to the Federals' overall strategy in bringing the rebels back into the Union. In August 1863, American President Abraham Lincoln tasked General William S. Rosecrans and the Army of the Cumberland with capturing the city. If the city were taken, the Union would have an open door to the manufacturing hub of Atlanta, Georgia. The South could ill afford to lose both cities. The men tasked with defending Chattanooga encompassed the Confederate Army of Tennessee, led by General Braxton Bragg. In mid-August, Rosecrans struck Chattanooga and caught Bragg by surprise. Unable to maneuver, Bragg abandoned the city and retreated into northern Georgia and set up encampments near the east bank of the Chickamauga Creek. Rosecrans followed in pursuit, setting up headquarters on the opposite side of the creek. These actions set the stage for the second largest and bloodiest battle in the Civil War and the largest in the Western Theater. The Army of Tennessee was the primary army in the Western Theater, which encompassed all the land and battles which were fought west of the Appalachian Mountains and east of the Mississippi River. Bragg was an incompetent general who was not well liked or trusted by his men or officers. His poor leadership skills resulted in his army suffering significant defeats against Rosecrans and the Confederacy losing most of Tennessee. Rosecrans, on the other hand, was immensely popular with his men and was considered a rising star in the Federal officer corps. Confederate President Jefferson Davis realized that the situation in the Western Theater was dire. Thus, he dispatched 12,000 men from Lieutenant General James Longstreet's First Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, commanded by General Robert E. Lee, to join Bragg's army. These men, who saw defeat at Gettysburg, were anxious to get back at the Yankees and to redeem themselves. Reinforcements also arrived from Mississippi under command of Brigadier General Bushrod Johnson. These men arrived just in time to take part in the upcoming battle. This was the first time that Confederate troops were sent by railway from one theater to another to improve the situation in that area. The Battle of Chickamauga began at dawn on September 19th. Overnight, both sides moved their troops into position, anticipating the battle would begin the next day. Much of the fighting that took place occurred in thick forests where soldiers could barely see 100 feet in front of them in some instances. This contributed to a great deal of confusion throughout the battle for both sides. Confederate troops under Major General John C. Breckinridge, former U.S. Vice President, struck hard at the left flank of the Federal Army on the northern edge of the battlefield, anchored by the Kelly Field, were repulsed on multiple occasions. The Yankees, who had built small makeshift fortifications, largely of wood, overnight, turned this part of the battlefield into a formidable position. Many northern troops also had Spencer repeating rifles, which they were able to purchase with their pay, compared to Confederate soldiers who only had single-shot muskets. As a result, the casualties among the southern ranks were considerably heavy. All throughout the day, the rebels launched assault after assault at the Federal position, but to no avail. A new strategy for the Confederates was needed. Longstreet's corps arrived in the evening, and with these new reinforcements, Bragg divided the army into wings. Longstreet would command the left wing, while Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk would command the right wing. With these reinforcements, Chickamauga became one of the few battles where the Confederates outnumbered their Union opponents, and this would significantly contribute to the result of the battle. September 20th began with similar attacks to the previous day on the Union's left flank. The Confederates could not manage to break through the Federal lines no matter how many assaults they launched, and each one resulted in massive casualties. The Southerners, however, would soon receive some good luck that would turn the battle to their advantage. In the late morning, due to confusion, Rosecrans believed that a gap had formed in the center of his line. He ordered that a division, commanded by Brigadier General Thomas J. Wood, be pulled to fill this gap. Wood only made this move under assurance that new units be placed where his lines used to be. Only a small number of troops were left in this immediate area. Ironically, there was not a gap in this part of the battlefield. It created one, and Longstreet's assault was due to move right through this area. This assault, led by Johnson and his Tennesseans, tore straight through the remaining thin line of Federals near Brotherton Cabin. All that could be heard was the famous rebel yell, the Confederate rallying cry. The defenders did not stand a chance and quickly withdrew in panic with the Confederates hot on their tails. This assault effectively broke the Federal Army in two, with the entire right flank dissolving into disorganized retreat towards Chattanooga. Rosecrans himself fled from the field. During this time, the battered remains of the Union line that had not withdrawn from the field reformed on the southern face of Snodgrass Hill. General George H. Thomas became the new commander on the field. The situation was dire for the Federals, and they did not have many options for their defense. They had to stand and wait for the Confederate onslaught. The initial contact between the two forces occurred at 1 o'clock p.m. At this time, Brigadier General Joseph B. Kershaw's South Carolina Brigade of Lafayette McLaws Division, along with Brigadier General Benjamin Humphrey's brigade, smashed into the Union lines and achieved limited success. After a brief engagement in which Federal troops in the vicinity withdrew after a short Confederate volley, Thomas arrived on the scene to stabilize the line and used the Snodgrass House as his headquarters. Union reinforcements were brought up and they were thrown into the fray. These reinforcements, along with reorganized units from the previous engagement around the Brotherton Cabin, were positioned around Snodgrass Hill, west into the woods and nearby Horseshoe Ridge. This ridge was heavily forested and provided ideal cover for a defense force. The troops on Horseshoe Ridge were commanded by Major General James S. Nagley. Nagley himself would later also flee the field and be court-martialed after the battle. Artillery was brought up to fortify Snodgrass, and this, along with musket fire, devastated Kershaw's brigade. The Southerners in turn withdrew down the hill and reorganized for another attack. This continued for nearly half an hour before Kershaw withdrew, taking position in a ditch at the bottom of the hill. Among those that witnessed grisly attack was Lieutenant Robert H. Jennings of Company G, 3rd Battalion, South Carolina Infantry. He documented his experiences from his unit's transfer from Lee's army after Gettysburg to the banks of the Chickamauga Creek and beyond. He began his entry on Chickamauga by detailing the encounter the battalion had with General Kershaw when he came to the battalion and directed his men toward Snodgrass Hill. Jennings went on to document his experience of the fight on Snodgrass Hill in superb detail. Quote, "As we reached the brow of the hill, my orderly, Sergeant J. W. Ashford, being at my side, caught me by the head and said, 'Lieutenant, I am shot.' I replied, 'Goodbye, old fellow, I must go forward.' I left him, never expecting to see him again. He was hit on the right side, the ball coming out near the spine. We advanced down a ravine through the woods, and I must say, though I was in 20 battles and skirmishes, The balls came quicker and faster from Snodgrass Hill than I ever witnessed before. As we reached the bottom of the ravine, I saw the enemy bringing up a field piece, and I said, "Boys, they are going to fire on us." And instantly there was a discharge of grape and canister." Unquote. Shortly after this, Jennings' superior, Captain Townsend, was wounded, and the color bearer or flag bearer was also wounded. The color bearer gave Jennings the flag, and he hoisted it up high so the whole battalion could see it. At that moment, 2 bullets struck the staff holding the flag, nearly splitting it in 2. Jennings was also hit in the leg by a bullet and was forced to give the colors to another bearer and retire from the field. Unfortunately, Townsend died from his wounds, while Jennings and Ashford eventually healed and returned to the battalion. This journal entry was later recorded in the Herald and News in Newberry, South Carolina, on May 12, 1911. Bushrod Johnson arrived in the area around 1:30 to apply pressure to neighboring Horseshoe Ridge. These men charged up the hill towards the Federal ranks and similarly met a similar volley as their predecessors. However, they were able to push over the crest of the hill, but eventually Union reinforcements arrived and forced them back down the hill. At this same moment, the Federals were able to catch a long-needed breather. Reserve units under the command of Major General Gordon Granger, numbering around 7,500 men, arrived on the field after being on duty in nearby Rossville. Bragg at this time was becoming discouraged by the failed assaults on Snodgrass. This was largely due to a lack of coordination. Longstreet pressed for continued assaults along a wider area to throw the Federals off balance, but this was refused by Bragg, who was cautious and wished to wait until the situation was assessed later. For the rest of the afternoon, assault after bloody assault was launched on Snodgrass and Horseshoe Ridge with minimal effect. Despite the reinforcements, with the evening approaching, the Federals began running out of ammunition and Thomas was growing weary. The rebels saw an opportunity. Bragg summoned Longstreet to his headquarters and ordered him to renew the attack. The assault commenced at 3:30 up the slopes of Snodgrass and Horseshoe, with the rebel yell echoing throughout the landscape. Over the next half hour, there would be continuous bloody volleys of musketry, attacks, and counterattacks. For the time being, Thomas's line held, and the rebels once again fell back down the hill. Despite this, the situation was starting to get desperate for the Federals. With the lack of available ammunition and declining morale, they were not sure if they would be able to withstand another assault. Around 4:30, the Federals' left flank around Kelly Field began to withdraw towards Chattanooga. This left only the men on Snodgrass and Horseshoe on the field. Thomas realized that further resistance was futile and began to slowly withdraw the men. Once the withdrawal was nearly complete, only the 21st and 22nd Michigan and 89th Ohio regiments were left on the hill. Ultimately, these 3 regiments will stand their ground until they are forced to surrender to Confederate forces under the command of Brigadier General William Preston, who had recently stormed the hill. At this point, the sun began to set over the battlefield. Thus ended the Battle of Chickamauga and the fight on Snodgrass Hill. Though a victory for the South, it was a costly one at that. The battle resulted in over 16,000 Union casualties and over 18,000 Confederate casualties. Chickamauga proved to be the Confederates' last major victory that was fought on the open field with little to no fixed fortified defenses, had over 50,000 men involved on both sides, and demoralized the Federals for a few months. Bragg allowed for the Federals to retreat to the defenses of Chattanooga and missed an opportunity to destroy the Army of the Cumberland in one fell swoop. However, the battle gave the Confederates a brief chance of hope of recognized independence and rebirth of national spirit. The Federals would not attempt to push back into Georgia until the following year. Thomas would go on to command the now besieged Army of the Cumberland in Chattanooga after President Lincoln personally had Rosecrans sacked. Despite the siege, things start to look up for them, at least as far as leadership is concerned. Meanwhile, with the Army of Tennessee, it was a different story. After the battle, Bragg blamed his subordinates for not following up on an attack on Chattanooga, and his corps commanders in turn blamed Bragg for his overcaution, costing a follow-up attack. The situation deteriorated enough that Bragg even dismissed Longstreet and his corps, and they began a long trek through winter to rejoin Lee in Virginia. Confederate victories would occur in 1864 in both theaters, but nothing to the magnitude of Chickamauga. It did nothing to reverse the inevitable downfall of the new nation except buy time. All this jubilee from the victory was crushed in November when Generals Grant and Sherman arrived to reinforce the besieged Army of the Cumberland in November 1863 and planned their own offensives at Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge. These successful assaults pushed the Confederates out of eastern Tennessee for good, led to the demise of Bragg, and set the stage for Sherman's campaign to capture Atlanta in the summer of 1864 and his eventual famed march to the sea in the late fall and early winter. Snodgrass Hill, a place that embodies the spirit of the American Civil War, where many men, North and South, gave the ultimate sacrifice for home and country, where General Thomas's gallant defense earned him the rallying cry, the Rock of Chickamauga, and the Confederacy received a brief glimmer of hope after a devastating summer. Countless acts of gallantry and devotion were performed on this hallowed ground. This stretch of land would go down in history as one of the most remembered spots of the Civil War, rivaling that of the wheat field of Gettysburg, Bloody Lane of Antietam, and the Hornet's Nest of Shiloh. Chickamauga was the second deadliest battle of the Civil War, only to Gettysburg, in the bloodiest 2 days of the entire conflict. Snodgrass Hill was at the heart of it all.